This is Brent with Lykins Motorsports, and this week's video is going to be an answer to the Q&A proposition that I had in my last video. I asked if anybody had any questions or specific topics that they would like for me to discuss. So we're going to go over a few things that people put in comments on the last video. The first thing that someone, I guess it's not the first thing, but it's top on the list, is a question or a request by Colin Artis, who said that he would like for me to discuss the various coatings that are available for engine components. So we'll take a few minutes and discuss that. You'll see various coatings added to different parts of the engine. There are coatings for the block, for bearings, for pistons, for wrist pins, even for combustion chambers and valves. The way that I break this down is basically based on the usage. And, you know, for a street build, you'll see engines go hundreds of thousands of miles with no coatings. As the horsepower and the type of application goes up, you will see, you know, coatings and applications to the inside of the engines, you know, be necessary as different components are exposed to different amounts of wear. I always use a coated bearing, and I started this a couple of years ago, and it's really not that much of an added cost, but, you know, we have an uncoated bearing versus a coated bearing. The coatings are applied by companies such as Calico and Swain, but, you know, after so many years of pulling down engines in, you know, extreme applications, I've noticed that the coated bearings just really don't show as much wear, and the coating is hard, and it acts just as a protective film over top of the normal layers of bearing material. And it's usually on each bearing shell half, it's usually about 2.5 10,000ths of an inch of coating. So in a complete pair, you know, if you were to check your bearing clearances, you'd probably lose generally about 1/2 thou of clearance when you apply coating to each shell. But this is a cheap upgrade, and I have seen the benefits of this, and I think pretty much every engine would benefit from this. You know, you would ask, well, if that's the case, why doesn't the OEM do that? Well, you know, if you look at the cost of a coated bearing over 1 million engines, you know, it starts to get expensive, and you know, their warranties only last for 3 years. So it's just to me, it's an added bonus, and as an engine builder, it's an added value and nicety to the engine, so that's why I use them. By the way, if you know, these are available over the counter in most forms. If you see like a Clevite bearing part, if it has a K on the end of it, it's coated. If you have an engine such as an FE or a Y block or a flathead or something like that, you can always send the bearings out and have them coated. So, you know, we talked about coatings for the engine blocks. You'll see guys apply, you know, what's called Gliptol to the inside of the engine block. Gliptol was something I think that was developed by GE for coating the inside of electric motors. This is just my opinion, and obviously there are different opinions, but I don't believe anything needs to be inside a running engine like that. Gliptol or paint or anything is brushed on, and I know that Gliptol is very hard and sometimes baked on, but I've seen it flake off, and I've seen, you know, cylinder heads that have come through here from other engine builders that have had that stuff on there, and it's not, you know, you spray the inside of on the top of a cylinder head, and it builds up around where your valve spring locators go, and then your valve spring locator rubs, you know, against it, and it starts to flake off. I've seen it flake off on the inside of lifter valleys, and, you know, over the course of years when engines are rebuilt and they go through hot tanks and jet washes and that sort of thing, it'll come off. And you just don't want that kind of crud going through your oil pump. So I know different guys use it. I choose not to, and my opinion is nothing belongs on you know, the engine block itself. You can apply coatings to pistons. These are Molle pistons, and they come with their coating as a standard option. It's a Molle coating. It's applied to the crown and to the skirts. I think that's an added bonus if you want to do it, especially the skirt coatings, because that just gives a you know, a little extra protection on the cylinder, the part of the piston that rubs the cylinder. If you have a custom pistons, it's easy to do, but it's expensive. I think it's generally 20 or 30 bucks a piston to have that done. So you have to weigh the cost against what you think you're going to get out of it. If it's a, you know, a bracket motor, I don't know. If it's a, you know, motor that you want to go 300,000 miles with, yeah, maybe. If it's a endurance engine, such as, you know, a road race piece or something like that, yeah, probably. The crown coatings, I generally only go to if, you know, somebody wants, you know, all the options available for a piston. It does lower or help lower the surface temperature of the piston during combustion. Generally, though, we only go to it when we want to protect the top of the piston against extreme heat, such as forced induction or nitrous or something like that. So in the overall scale of should we do it, I would say if you want to swing for the skirt coatings, you can. The crown coatings are just kind of if you want to pull the trigger on everything. Wrist pins, Colin mentioned DLC, which is diamond-like carbon. This wrist pin is not coated. This is just a natural tool steel wrist pin. But I have these coated from time to time, and it's generally during high vacuum applications, such as if you're running a vacuum pump or a dry sump pump, because those pumps create a vacuum inside the engine, create a void of I guess pressure, and in certain situations you can see where the oil film may be pulled away from certain components, such as bearings, such as wrist pins, that sort of thing. It also protects against wear on extreme applications. I would do this on, you know, extreme horsepower, extreme RPM. I'm talking about, you know, getting close to 1,000 horsepower, you know, over 7,000 RPM, that sort of thing. Extreme loading also will protect the wrist pin if it's coated. Combustion chambers and valves, you know, you can have the inside of your combustion chamber coated against heat. It's a thermal protection, and you'd also have your valve heads coated. I would only consider that sort of thing necessary in very extreme heat applications, such as forced induction, a lot of boost, a lot of spray, that sort of thing. It can get expensive. It's, and, you know, on top of the coating cost, you're looking at the cost of sending, you know, your cylinder heads back and forth. And, you know, on the list of should I do that, I would consider that on, you know, the very bottom of the list. All right, so hope that answers some questions, and we'll go on to the next topic. Okay, so the next request that we have is from a YouTube subscriber by the name of One Old Texan, and he's wanted me to go over necessary oil modifications for the FE block. I'll preface all this by saying, you know, there's lots of techniques and opinions here. I don't want to knock what anybody else does, but I think a lot of people get carried away when it comes down to oil mods. I think over the years, people have got into the habit of their own technique, and then their own technique has somehow become gospel for a certain engine family. You know, what you want to do is your own business, but, you know, I think a lot of things are unjustified, and some things can be harmful, and I'll go over a couple of those things right now. The biggest thing that I see is your oil pump feed hole on FE blocks. These can be extremely small on factory blocks, especially 390s and 428s. And this is usually the first thing that I address. This block's already been, it came like this to my shop, and I don't necessarily, you know, suggest that you open it up this far, but I do suggest that you gasket match your oil pump, because the holes that are generally, you know, right here in a factory block are, you know, maybe, I don't know, 3/8 in diameter or so, and it's really small. So the first thing that I like guys to do, or like to see guys do, is to open this up, gasket match that hole. And you can also take a sand roll or a cartridge roll and kind of shape the roof. It would be the roof as I'm looking at it, the underside of this passage here, because typically this goes straight down and then straight that way. So you want to kind of smooth the bottom of this out, and then smooth right under where my pinky is right now, and make that a general curve. The next thing that is pretty necessary is your bearing holes, your main saddle holes. Generally speaking, you will see this being an issue on number 1, number 2, and I think number 4, if I remember right off the top of my head. And you only need to do that depending on the bearing that you're using. If you use something like a full groove king bearing, it's got this big honking hole in the middle of it. You don't have to do anything to the main saddles in your block. But if you're using something like a 3/4 groove Federal Mogul bearing, or a Cleveite bearing or something like that, it's got this narrow oil hole in it, you'll find out that when you put the bearing down on the saddle, that it'll cover up a lot of the hole. So that needs to be addressed, and the way that you address it is not to hog that hole out. You really don't want to disturb that bearing saddle, that main saddle hole, any more than you have to, because that's kind of a weak spot in FEs. So if you're taking a drill and you're drilling it out all the way down, I would say that's a no-no. If you're taking a die grinder and you're going down and you're just, you know, dogging that thing out, I would say that's a no-no. What I like to do is just as little as possible near the mouth of the hole. Just take a little die grinder or a Dremel and lay that hole back, and kind of flare it out at the top in the direction that the oil needs to go to meet the bearing. I've seen too many FE blocks cracked right here. I had a 427 block came in years and years ago, and every single main was cracked where this feed hole was. So, and you know, I've heard a lot over the years that is a weak spot for FEs. I've seen a lot of guys say, hey, I cracked the mains there. Back in a couple decades ago, when these blocks were used a lot in super stock, I've heard of guys, you know, after you split this feed, you know, they pull the engine down and sleeve that hole to keep it from bleeding oil pressure off. So just do the least amount of work there that you have to do. Okay, the next area, this is a 428 block, it's bagged, but this is the flange where your oil filter adapter bolts up. Here's the 4 bolts, pop, pop, pop. Here's the feed that goes up, and it goes diagonally. You can see the casting right here. It goes all the way up to right here, and then it shoots back up that direction. You'll see a lot of guys say that they want to drill this out, this hole. You do not need to drill that out. That's about 7/16 as cast. So you don't need to take a drill and drill all of that out. That doesn't need to be touched. If you want to do anything at all, you can stick a cartridge roll in it and smooth the opening of it up. But yeah, this size hole will support 7,500 RPM and a whole lot of horsepower, so that doesn't need to be done. The next area is your gallery plugs, and I wouldn't consider this an oil mod, but it is an added feature that you can do and may help you out in the future. All of these are usually soft plugs, and the one behind the distributor is soft plug as well. I drill and tap all these to a 1/4-inch pipe plug, and it just makes for a neater installation, and it reduces the chance of anything popping out under pressure over time. Okay, the next area, and again, you can list this under oil mods, or I guess not, but this is the feed hole in the cylinder head. That's what feeds your rocker arms. If you choose to oil through the head, I generally don't. I oil through the push rod. So what I do on this is I'll drill, or not, you don't have to drill it, you can tap it and put a plug in there and block that off. If you're oiling through the heads, this hole doesn't need to be any bigger than 70 or 80 thousandths. So I would restrict that hole down, especially on factory heads where you have a pretty big hole. In a factory head, that's almost 5/16 of an inch hole, which is huge. So if you do have, if you're running a high volume pump or something like that, you'll get a tremendous amount of oil to the top. So this is a good place to limit that. You can also do it in the deck surface of the block, but I really don't like doing it there. If you ever, have to change the way that the engine is oiling, or you want to change cams or something like that, then that requires pulling the heads and undoing what you did in the block deck. So in addition to all these things that I've been talking about, I would say opening, well, let's recap real quick. Opening the oil pump mounting flange hole is very important. Depending on what bearing you're using, the holes in the main saddles need to be adjusted. That's very important. Drilling and tapping the block for screw-in plugs, it's not necessary, but it's nice. I would say this is pretty important. If you're oiling through the heads, you don't want, more oil up here than what you need. In addition to all that, a deep oil pan is nice. Anytime that you can add capacity, that will cool the oil as the engine is running, and it also reduces windage and parasitic horsepower losses due to the oil being up near the crankshaft. So a deep sump pan works very, very well. Okay, the next request is from a YouTuber named Jack Wells. He wants to know if we would build an engine differently for torque than we would for horsepower, and the answer is yes. And it's the majority of the work would be in the camshaft, because even if you're wanting a high torque engine, and low RPM engine, the better the cylinder head, the better performing cylinder head that you have. That's a plus. So you want to get all the flow that you can get without really hogging out the ports. You have to keep that balance of flow and velocity. So on the cylinder head side, you want some flow, but you don't want to get to the point where you're just increasing the port volume, to the point where you lose all your velocity. So you want flow and velocity both on the cylinder head side. On the camshaft side, you generally want a lower duration, and duration is a variable that's dependent on cylinder head flow, on displacement, on a lot of things. But we generally lower the 50 thousandths duration for more torque. And I typically, if the combination allows, I tighten up the lobe separation as well, because I've found that adds a lot of torque. So generally speaking, in terms of induction, you want high flow, high velocity on your intake and on your cylinder heads, and a lower duration camshaft. Your ignition curve plays into that a little bit, depending on what the vehicle is and what you're doing with it. And, displacement plays a lot into it. The larger the engine, the easier it is to make torque at a lower RPM. And, the bigger the motor, the better if you're aiming for torque. Hope that helps. I know that's pretty vague. If you have a more specific request, Jack, just let me know, and I'll see if I can help you on that. Okay, so the next question is from John. He wants to know, pertaining to oil mods and that sort of thing, what bearing clearances due to the internal cooling of an engine. So I've never seen a direct correlation to bearing oil clearances and oil temperature, unless you have completely the wrong ones and you're making temperature because you got stuff touching that shouldn't be touching. As far as main and rod bearing clearances, I have a rule of thumb that I go by, and it's an inch of bearing clearance a thousandth of bearing clearance per inch of journal size. So on FE, with a 2750 main journal size, I like to see somewhere around, anywhere between 2.5 and 3 thousandths on bearing clearance. Obviously, if it's too tight, then you're going to see some heat, because you're probably going to see some stuff touching that you shouldn't be touching, or it shouldn't be touching. Same with your rod bearing clearances. The same rule of thumb applies to your rod journals and your rod bearing clearances. Cam bearings, I do some stuff that a lot of guys don't do with cam bearings. I usually measure the cam bearing clearance the same that I would the main and rod bearing clearances. And you can adjust those. There's not different size bearings available on the inside diameter, but you can, if you don't have enough clearance, you can polish the journals down and get some clearance. So that data has come to me over the years from really high-end race motors with, extreme amounts of valve spring pressure that load the cam into the bearing. And I've found that, we need to size the cam bearing clearances exactly like we would in the main and rods, so we can get the correct amount of oil flow to the cam bearings. So you'll also see the oil pan change the oil temperatures a lot. If you have a factory capacity oil pan, 4 or 5 quarts, something like that, the pan is chucked up closer to the block, and it doesn't give you a lot of airflow across it. So you'll see the oil temperatures a little bit higher than you would if you were using, a really deep sump oil pan, where the oil, falls all the way to the bottom of the pan, and, it's far away from the block and there's good airflow across it. Otherwise, I have not seen a direct correlation between, you know, internal engine bearings and oil temperature. I do see a lot of guys get in trouble with incorrect bearing clearances, and, you know, take your time and check all your clearances, guys, and don't trust plastic gauge. If you have a piece of plastic gauge in your shop, sling it out in the yard, because they're not worth anything. Invest in a good set of mics and a bore mic. You know, even a $150 bore mic from MSC or Granger or something like that will suffice if you're doing an engine, you know, one engine a year or something like that. So, you know, we determine bearing clearances by, you know, measuring the outside of the journal, setting our bore mic to that, and then checking the inside diameter of your bearing bore housing in your block or in your rod, and getting the differential measurement. So that is a very accurate way of doing it. You'll also see guys with a mic that has ball ends, and they'll measure the thickness of the bearing shell and subtract that from the inside diameter of their housing. You can do it a couple different ways. Just don't use that dental floss junk. So, all right, I'll step down off my soapbox and we'll go to the next topic. Okay, the last request is from a gentleman named Stu Deadman, and Stu wants to know if I have any experience with the Edelbrock ProFlow stuff, and yes, I do. Here's an intake manifold for it. This one's been fully ported. This one's going on a 510 cubic inch FE motor. I really like the multi-port setups with fuel injection. Although I do not have a lot of experience with fuel injected stuff, because most of my builds are, you know, period correct looking builds, or, you know, race builds with a carburetor. So I probably don't have the amount of knowledge that some other builders do when it comes to fuel injection stuff. The other experiences that I've had have been throttle body fuel injection systems. I've used the fast system from Comp, which is just a throttle body fuel injection. MSD has theirs, and Holley has their Sniper version. Those are self-learning throttle body systems, and I think all those systems work, you know, fairly well. They each have their own, I guess, pros and cons, but for the most part, you can bolt those on and get some, you know, fuel injected benefits from that. Typically, I don't like fuel injected stuff. I'm kind of old school, and you know, I don't think that a fuel injected motor will make more horsepower than a carbureted motor. But I also know that a carbureted motor doesn't like to start at 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So, you know, whereas a fuel injected motor, you can get in and turn the key and just sit there and it'll idle and warm itself up and you're all happy. But I think everybody has their own preferences and applications vary. But yeah, here's the ProFlow. I recommend this setup. This intake has been ported. Otherwise, the Victor itself, the runners and the port openings are smallish, so, you know, it'll work okay on smaller cubic inch engines like a 390 or so. Typically, we don't, you know, reach out for a big single plane intake for a small engine, but with you know, port, fuel injected, and reasonably sized ports, this setup would work, you know, very well. Obviously, Edelbrock makes good stuff, so I have all the good to say about Edelbrock. But yeah, this is a good setup. The throttle body stuff is good. The self-learning stuff is good. You know, you just have to get out and drive the self-learning stuff. You can't really put it on a dyno, an engine dyno, and expect it to be right out of the box. It takes lots of driving in different RPMs and different scenarios and different situations for it to become, you know, accustomed to what the engine needs. All right, guys, so that was the last request, and, you know, I'll be happy to do more of these in the future if you just speak up and let me know what you would like for me to speak about. I am, you know, no means a industry expert in a lot of this stuff, but I'll tell you what my experiences are and what my opinions are, and you can take it with what it's worth. But I appreciate y'all watching. If we have any new guys watching, please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and I appreciate y'all. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week.